in his early 30s living in Fayetteville, North Carolina. He and his family are in the middle of an eviction crisis and are facing eviction in the middle of winter during the deadliest moment in the COVID pandemic. Here's a photo of Jones from the Fayetteville Observer. He recently received a call from his wife asking why there was a sheriff's deputy at their door, telling her that she had to take her 9-year-old and 2-year-old out of their home and into the cold. Rakim scrambled back from court with a declaration from the CDC, a piece of paper exempting the family from eviction. That piece of paper was supposed to protect his family from being evicted, but it didn't. The deputy was told to evict them anyways. Rakim put his family in his neighbor's car and watched them drive off as his front door was nailed shut. Now, what's particularly noteworthy about this case is that there are protections and were protections that were supposed to prevent things like this from happening. The governor of North Carolina issued an executive order to protect families like Rakim's, and the CDC issued an eviction ban that lasts until December 31st. And there was a North Carolina pandemic relief program that provides grant money to families like Rakim's to help them stay in their homes. But the judge who heard his case was not familiar with these protections. He ruled against the family, and they were eventually ordered to pay $1,000 out of their pocket. Now, the family received $2,500 for rent from the relief program, but his landlord rejected the money because, get this, the landlord feared that it would impact their ability to be able to evict the family later. Their lawyer at Legal Aid successfully fought for the Jones family to be able to go back home, but as we speak, they live in a state of uncertainty, not knowing whether they will be able to remain in their home when the current eviction ban expires on December 31st. Now, the fact that people are losing their homes right now during this already terrifying time should be a serious cause for alarm. But it's so much worse than that. There's new research from the Journal of Urban Health that shows that evictions are causing dramatic increases in COVID infection rates. And we need government intervention because without it, landlords are not going to stop evicting people. So as part of the CARES Act, the federal government issued its own temporary halt on evictions that lasted until July 24th. In between July 24th and September 4th, when the CDC issued its own temporary ban on evictions proceedings jumped by 400%. Now, that study says that this historic jump in evictions led to nearly 500,000 more unnecessary COVID cases and almost 11,000 additional deaths. And there are so many reasons for that. That's because people who are evicted frequently have to move in with other people, compounding the risk of infection as more people are crammed into tight living spaces. Other people are forced to live on the street where it is impossible to follow CDC guidelines like washing hands or staying indoors and isolating from others. And in the midst of all of this, local and state leaders have overwhelmingly failed to step up in response. While the federal government, led by Republican outgoing President Donald Trump and Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, have done next to nothing to stop this very avoidable disaster. And so I want to tell you another story about a person who is suffering from the eviction crisis. Israel Rodriguez and his family, including a 20-month-old and a 4-year-old, were evicted by the Houston Sheriff's Department. Israel unsuccessfully pleaded with the police, saying that he had nowhere else to go. All his family had left was a $361 uncashed check. He and his wife tried to identify a shelter close by, within walking distance, because they don't have a car and they had to carry all of their children's belongings on them. The officer involved in this case said it was the worst part of his job. He told CNN reporters, quote, "I am calling on the federal government to put additional money locally so that we can continue to help people with rent so that they don't get kicked out. We don't want this. This is no one's fault. Now, Israel's family is one of thousands who were forced out of their homes after the eviction ban in the federal COVID relief bill expired. Houston's $15 million rental relief fund ran out just 90 minutes after it opened. And so public health experts are urgently calling again for programs that suspend rent, that provide small landlords with the relief that they need, and that stop any evictions during the course of this pandemic. Instead of directing police to put people out on the street, local elected leaders need to pass eviction bans. States need to rapidly expand relief programs like the one that Rakeem Jones and his family received. And they need to take measures to make sure that landlords accept those rent payments and don't use COVID as a reason to hurt families in eviction proceedings during or after the pandemic. And we can also address this with legislation that is sitting before Congress right now. Representative Ilhan Omar's Rent, Mortgage, and Cancellation Act would cancel rent and pay landlords and banks on behalf of renters and homeowners. Now, this is a win-win for everyone. We know that this kind of policy saves lives, cuts down on pandemic spread everywhere, and it would also help the economy. Renters and homeowners wouldn't have to worry about getting deep into debt over failing to pay their bills during a pandemic. And small landlords would get compensated so they don't have to try to squeeze money out of people who don't have it. And let's be clear, the relief is about more than money. This is about lives. This is about tens of thousands of preventable deaths and hundreds of infections. Israel Rodriguez, Rakeem Jones, their families, their children, they don't deserve to risk getting sick and dying just because government leaders have failed to address the pandemic or its economic devastation despite so many warnings from health and economic experts. Now, elected leaders like Ilhan Omar and others are working to get relief passed now, but they need help. So no matter where you live, call your local, state, federal elected officials and tell them that your community needs rent relief now. This isn't some complex, nuanced policy decision. This is people's lives. This is people's livelihood on the line in the middle of the deadliest pandemic that we have seen in a century. And if you live in New York, like I do, call your elected officials and tell them that they need to support State Senator Julia Salazar's bill that would cancel rent during the pandemic. And there are so many other efforts across the country that you can support and amplify. In Los Angeles, City Council member-elect Nithya Raman ran on a campaign to forgive rent and is following through by amplifying local efforts to cancel rent debt. And in the Senate, Elizabeth Warren has introduced a nationwide eviction ban that would extend through the pandemic. Now, as we've discussed on this program, whether or not anything gets through the Senate could come down to those upcoming Georgia elections on January 5th between Democratic challengers Raphael Warnock and Jon Ossoff and Republicans Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue. Those elections will determine which party controls the Senate. If Democrats do win, it could pave the way for comprehensive federal relief from a bill like Ilhan Omar's, or at least a Band-Aid that keeps families in homes under an eviction ban included in the Senator Warren's legislation. If Democrats lose, it will be up to local and state leaders across the country to make sure there is an eviction ban in place in their areas. Anything less will cost tens of thousands of lives as the pandemic rages on. And so, to wrap things up, Rakeem Jones and his family, Israel Rodriguez and his family, these are just a few of the tens of millions of people in this country who need help, who are struggling through no fault of their own, and who could face eviction and an increased risk of COVID infection and death. There's one solution: a ban on evictions that lasts throughout the pandemic, and the kind of federal funding that ensures renters, homeowners, and landlords are all able to get through this crisis together. That's all the time we have today. Thanks for joining the Appeal Live. I'm Alana Sivan. We'll be back again tomorrow follow Appeal Live or follow Appeal News on Facebook